This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Joey asks me about optimism. Got any? Got it? Good.
Woo!
This is what a Joey sounds like without song. And this is what an executive producer and chanteuse Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. You've described this as me sometimes, but I do not know what it means.
It just means singer, but it sounds fancier.
It sounds like chartreuse. And in my mind, you're calling
a chartreuse chanteuse.
A chartreuse chanteuse. Yeah.
Well, Jessica, we've had a lot of technical difficulties getting here today. Thanks, internet. So forget your housekeeping. Not you, the greater you. Everyone's house is dirty. It is spring. We can get to it later. I wanted to talk to you about something I've been thinking a lot about recently. And I think not with divulging the conversation, but you brought something up to me recently about me being a very optimistic person, and that sort of perspective seems to influence the way that I anticipate certain things or what can be done in certain amounts of time and things like that. And so it's been on my head a lot, and just sort of background processing, trying to do the perpetual self-reflection thing and grow and all of that. And there's been a lot of conversation, I would say, maybe not new conversation, but I would say an increased focus on teen mental health and sort of the broader cultural mental health state in the past few months. I think there have been some conversations about people still not necessarily having sort of in their well-being and in their mental wellness recovered from the pandemic. The teen mental health data is sort of pointing towards smartphones and these other things being sort of major detractors of overall mental well-being, particularly in what would be the younger side of Gen Z and now Gen Alpha. And those two ideas are sort of bumping into each other. In some of the studies around overall mental health, there are some things pointing beyond just teens to 2015 sort of being a big moment where there seems to be increased decline in overall mental well-being, pessimism. There have been some recent reports about people's overall perspective on the future and being extremely pessimistic about the future despite consistent gains and sort of positive data that seems to emerge, whether that's about economics, whether that is about declines in things like global hunger or improvements in climate change, technology, whatever it is. It seems like we're constantly confronting this pessimism, and I don't know what to do with it. I've just been going through these questions of, can we become more optimistic? What are the benefits of optimism? Are there countervailing benefits to pessimism? Like, what should we be doing with this? And so my question for you is, how should we feel about optimism?
Well, maybe it starts with the trade-offs of having an optimistic outlook, right? Like it sounds, you know, I think part of the question is there anything that optimism gets us? Is there anything that it detracts from? Are there things that you might think that it is good for, but is actually kind of neutral? Like the first thing that I think about is having a having an optimistic outlook. Like to what extent is that related to your motivation to do stuff? Like if you are
Hmm.
optimistic, does that mean that you're more motivated? Or if you're pessimistic, does that mean you're more motivated to like act on something or you do you know what I mean? Like that's a
Yeah.
question. I feel like there's a lot of things that might lead into breaking apart how useful it is.
Yeah. I in again sort of cursory research. I haven't fully fallen down the rabbit hole necessarily yet. I was curious just to see like how is this genetically predisposed, and in some of that research, one, it shows that there are um, genetic corollaries. It seems in some of the studies that are being done to optimism, but as with most things, that is sort of a combination of nature and nurture. Maybe you're more likely with genetics, but there are environmental factors that can increase optimism, like um, what I read was moderately structured early childhood. But in doing some of that cursory research, there does seem to be connections to action, like you were talking about, right? If you are optimistic, there's a tendency to presume a positive outcome or the
Mhm.
ability to accomplish something. And so in turn, there is a higher likelihood of taking an action, right? Even if your presumption is inaccurate for one reason or another, the idea that you think a positive outcome can be achieved results in a higher likelihood of attempting to achieve whatever that thing is.
Right. Though I think you could equally be motivated by just this is important and even if I'm not sure, like I should try. Um but that's I feel like it would make sense that in that sense it doesn't seem necessarily harmful to be optimistic. I also wonder if like there's another piece about this that might be a matter of like selective optimism. Like can you still be optimistic in some places but not in others and still even if you don't universally identify as somebody optimistic,
Hmm.
can you still
Yeah,
wield it, you know what I mean?
yeah. Well, it's it. I think that's probably true, right? You could build an optimism over time based on demonstrated competency, maybe, right? That you are good at a particular thing, so you're more optimistic at the outcomes in a particular area just based on historical patterns, maybe, right? That you're good at basketball, so you have a belief that you will win, but maybe you're not as good at math, and so that optimism is not necessarily like a global phenomena in your individual person, as it is sort of like you said, occasion selective versus this idea of potentially like I don't know that anyone is, and maybe I guess they probably, some small portion of people probably are sort of universally optimistic that encounter every situation as um, a sort of in a positive light or with the view of having a positive outcome. In one of the articles on genetics that I was reading, it referenced a Winston Churchill quote that said, um, uh, an optimist sees an opportunity in every calamity, a pessimist sees a calamity in every opportunity. That is where that sort of like global idea exists. Like maybe even just like at some point, do you cross over into like more than 50% of the occasions you encounter, you're viewing through an optimistic lens versus the opposite, you know?
Yeah. I also,
But do you feel like there is maybe, you know, all of this is anecdotal, I think, and maybe a product of the media environment that we exist in, but do you feel like there has been an increase in pessimism in recent years, and or, you know, the idea that encountering optimistic views is sort of met with not necessarily derision, but that optimistic perspectives on things can be sort of met with like a or sort of categorized as like Pollyanna-ish or like saccharine or naive?
yeah, I feel like I know what you're talking about, right? The idea that how could you possibly be an optimist when our world is boiling or like there's just like there are lots of things that are terrifying about the future and about the present. So I think it makes a lot of sense why there could be a perception that it would be naive or something to try to be hopeful in the wake of those things, almost as though it is sort of mutually exclusive to feel hopeful um and fully internalize the reality of the world. Like I think that probably is where that comes from is my guess. That you kind of have to choose like pragmatism or optimism. But I don't think that necessarily means that you have to choose pessimism, right? Like I think being I think that if that is indeed the origin behind maybe any sort of rejection of optimism, I think that it's the myth that pragmatism and optimism have to come at odds with one another, where in reality I think it's more like, can you just can, like is it still worth maybe it's not even about pessimism, it's more about nihilism. Like is there anything that you can do about it, or is it like nothing to be done? um uh and I think that's one thing. Another thing is um the idea of a healthy dose of pessimism as a kind of risk aversion, right? Like I'm not so sure of the outcomes because potentially that is dangerous to be blindly optimistic, right? Like how do you still have that steady, firm clarity of the circumstances, of the task at hand, of the uphill battle, and not swing too far into, oh, it can't be done, or oh, it for sure can be done? Like I don't know. There has to be, I think, like a healthy amount of each side.
Yeah, it's interesting in even in bringing up the sort of like the middle child syndrome of pragmatism in this, right? Which is maybe, yeah, in the way that we talk about things. I think even potentially before sort of the broader polarization in culture, I think we tend to think about the edges and the extremes, and you talk about either pessimism or optimism, and whether it's pragmatism or realism or however people sort of talk about that middle ground of trying to assess things. I think the only the potential pitfall, I suppose, is pragmatism or realism relies on your ability to assess a situation for risk, right? I mean, I think we are potentially like okay at assessing like gross risk or sort of, high level potential negative outcomes that are possible or positive outcomes that are possible. But, as was talked about a lot during the course of the pandemic was, we're pretty bad at risk assessment and risk calculation, broadly speaking, for any number of reasons, right? Like we're not particularly good at thinking probabilistically, even if,
or long things.
Yeah. and often you're talking about complex systems in making any decision, even if, in your family, at your work, when you start to get to like your city level, your neighborhood level, state, country, global, like the number of factors, like the reality is you just don't have the ability, like even the most powerful like computer modeling systems can't get enough data to make reliable predictions on those things. And so the optimistic view is just like, I don't know what's going to happen, but like aim for the good thing. And if you don't get the good thing, you don't get the good thing. But the idea of simply like aiming in that direction feels like it is one that leaves you more likely to achieve like a higher count of good things in aggregate, because you're simply aiming versus, it's the Wayne Gretzky, like you miss all the shots you don't take type of idea.
Yeah, well, of course you would say that because you're an optimist.
Yeah.
But like thinking in my mind, like if you associate pessimism with risk aversion with thinking defensively also is valuable, especially like in my mind, especially in the face of real and perceptible risk and danger. Like planning for the worst is also very useful, and I guess that's kind of what I was meaning in terms of motivation. Like even if there is a higher pervasiveness of pessimism right now, whether it is perfectly calculated, I'm certain it isn't, but I am not certain that's necessarily a bad thing if it inspires action, like defensive action. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Like, I think I'm someone who is also reasonably good at identifying and seeing problems, right? Sort of analyzing a situation and finding inefficiencies or things that aren't working, but maybe I still hold that like we can fix it, right? Like,
so,
like,
yeah. Well, and then maybe that is the thing that I was trying to get after with this like selective optimism, right? Like, can you be pessimistic about the way the world is heading, but optimistic about your own self-efficacy? Like, I can do something about it though, or like I best at least attempt, like I believe in myself, whether or not I believe in the goodness of other things or can't trust in other people, the like different pockets of pessimism may still exist.
Right.
Right.
But it seems like that, in some ways what you're talking about, like critical optimism, like it's not even pessimistic, right? Like,
yeah,
that we will be met with failure, but it is, right, a critical optimism of like looking for problems or things to fix, but also sort of us, starting from some assumptive place that those problems can in fact be resolved.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that makes sense.
I mean, I like critical optimism. I mean, it at least, right, like it says, like it sort of removes that like Pollyanna-ish or naivete from the equation.
Right, from associations of blind, instead of it being blind optimism, it's the opposite of that, right? Like eyes wide open optimism. um for that sort of seeking, searching, action oriented type
Yeah.
approach to the world.
The one thing before we wrap in our accelerated episode because of technology, the one thing that I did find that I thought was interesting was the connection of optimism and oxytocin in some of these genetic studies, which I find interesting in that, coming back to this idea of like nature versus nurture and how these ideas can interplay potentially, right? Like if there is sort of, let's call it a collective on some population level decline in optimism, what we also have seen is an increase in ideas that is sort of like being bashed over our heads from scientists and media and things like that around the increase in loneliness, right? And oxytocin, even if optimists have a connection, optimism has a connection to some genes, and those genes seem to be tied to oxytocin production. Everyone has oxytocin, right? It plays a role in a big role in female hormone cycles, but it's also a bonding hormone, and so a decline in oxytocin.
Yeah, it's called like the love hormone by some, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. It is released in sort of bonding moments, whether that is sort of platonic, whether that is sexual, whether that is maternal. It's heavily released during breastfeeding. But the idea of like, if we are collectively lonelier, we're bonding less, we're feeling disconnected, then maybe there is in fact a sort of population level decline in oxytocin, which would result in sort of declines in collective optimism, even if it is not necessarily in those cases genetically predisposed. And so that flip, right, that idea of like where do you find community, and do you have community, and do you feel like you have connections, maybe is a way to sort of spin your right. There's these ideas of like tribal leadership and things like that, where you're getting to this level of like, I am great to we are great. And in a lot of those we are great or life is great scenarios, being the peak of that tribal leadership idea, has to do with, a lot of it ties to optimism, and that we are great is connected to sort of feeling part of a community that can accomplish things, and that bonding of feeling connected to other people, releasing oxytocin, changing your optimism, changing your orientation towards action. Like it's sort of, it doesn't just like create an emphasis for us collectively, like on a societal level, to sort of reduce loneliness because that's bad and makes people sad and we want to get rid of it, but also potentially like implicates our ability to take collective action as a result of the fact that we are not forming strong enough relationships in our everyday life.
So what you're saying is, to save the world, we need to high five and hug each other more.
Yeah. High five, hug each other more. Like, the idea that like solving the climate crisis could in some way be connected to like, the ideas of like bowling alone, right? Like joining some like hobbyist community feels both absurd, but then also like makes it feel easier in some way. Like, oh, if we just make more friends, like that we could also maybe solve like extremely seemingly disconnected problems through just like a broader like pervasive optimism that might result in us feeling more connected to the people in our lives.
Well, maybe the optimists among us need to start initiating some of those hugs because, someone's got to start it.
Well, Jess, do you have a wrap-up corner for us? Jess's optimism corner?
Do you believe in life after love, after love? I can feel something going on in this podcast. So, yep. That's it. Was that chartreuse enough for you?
That was a chartreuse chanteuse. I appreciate it. Give someone a hug. You'll feel better. You might be more optimistic and solve the world's problems. Yeah. Hugs around the world.
That was nice, but it wasn't what I wanted.
Well, we did it. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by You Got It.
As always, we'd like to thank executive producer and digital hug, Jess Vander.
You're welcome. We'd also like to thank sound engineer and our sense of motivation, Alex Contel.
We'd like to thank programming coordinator and metaphorical high five, Les Jacobs.
And thanks to our production crew and, the construction workers of a positive future, Sarah Gilbert and Nora Mesrich.
And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Thanks.
Special thanks to the show Chimp Empire on Netflix, because I realized in you talking about hugs, and we had a talk recently about Steve Nash and they tracked for a season his high fives, fist bumps, and butt pats. Mm-hmm. And I watched the show Chimp Empire after that, and the chimps that were on patrol or knew they were about to be going into like battle against rival clans were doing butt pats as they were like walking down this path, and I was like, are butt pats like genetic? Are they like evolutionarily derived? Like I had seen this video about Steve Nash touching his teammates and then just seeing chimps do butt pats as they're like getting ready to go into battle. I was like, it just made me think about butt pats so differently. Like I was like, are monkeys just like butt patters? Like what is happening? It was a bizarre, surreal moment, but it was a good show. So thanks to them.
To be clear, while this episode may indicate we encourage people to hug and butt pat more, maybe make sure you're in an environment where everyone is consenting to such personal.
Yes.
Intimacy.
Yes. I don't think we're advocating
butt
for
strangers.
Yeah,
or even loved ones if you
we're not advocating for unconsenting butt pats, but
yep. Cool. Just
work butt pats. But if you're playing a sport and it seems to be allowed, it may be evolutionary. So but fist bumps, high fives, safe, hugs, consent, and butt pats, like extreme consent.
Actually, yeah. Special thanks. Alternatively, which who knows? Some scientists, no one has said this, but I could imagine a world where some scientists have proven that a perfect alternative to the butt pat is imagine that you're in thumb war position. So your four fingers with thumbs up are sort of clasped around another person's, and then you engage in what I just learned in recent years is a possible way to begin a thumb war, where instead of just like go, your thumbs touch and have sort of like a little kiss moment, and then they bow to each other and the thumbs bend, and then you start your thumb war duel, So you can also just press thumbs together. That's also an option that I have now painted vividly in your mind.
Can I also offer the ankle hug that Trevor and I have been doing as opposite side desk mates, as just like a way of like quick under the desk in moments where you're just like need a little boost? We've just done an ankle hug, and it's super bizarre, but it accomplishes that like quick boost of oxytocin, I'll tell you.
I'll tell you, people need to be butt patting and ankle hugging and thumb kicking more often. Consensual.
If you come up with new invented ways to acceptably accomplish this oxytocin dosing in work safe ways, like please share them with us because we are now curious.
Because now we'll try them.
Yeah. Love you, mean it. Bye.
Wishing you good hugs. Bye.